You know, nearly 30 years ago, I joined a good friend, the late Hub Vogelman, Dr. Vogelman in Vermont, along with a Republican congressman, a Democratic governor, and President Reagan's EPA administrator. We hiked up to the summit of Vermont's second highest peak, an iconic peak called Camel's Hump. We had a goal in mind. We wanted to observe firsthand what the effects were of acid rain. Well, you didn't have to be a scientist to see it. When we arrived at the summit, we saw the evidence we feared. It was like a scar burned across the peaks, not only Camel's Hump, but all the Green Mountains. And such a clear day, we could see across Lake Champlain to New York State, and you saw the same scar across the Adirondacks of New York. Due to human action, weather patterns had changed, altering the very chemistry of rainfall on a grand scale. And because those weather patterns had changed, we'd caused profound and large-scale damage to life-sustaining ecosystems, something that we humans did. Now, there were Democrats and Republicans, scientists and bureaucrats on that mountain. We returned to Washington united and eager to address the problem. It wasn't easy. We had to overcome strong objections from industry and develop an entirely new cap-and-trade regulatory framework. In the end, a Democratic majority in Congress passed, and Republican President George H.W. Bush signed into law the Clean Air Act amendments. Well, today we're confronted again with irrefutable evidence that humans have altered not just the weather of a region, but the climate of the entire planet. This time, we don't need to climb mountains to see the damage. We see it in New England's flood-ravaged river valleys. We see it in California's scorched farmland, in Alaska's retreating glaciers, and Wyoming's burnt forests and superstorm-ravaged coastlines. Before we even get to the accumulated, and unfortunately accumulating, scientific evidence for climate change and the carbonization of our fragile envelope of atmosphere, all we have to do is apply common sense. As we look around us anywhere, everywhere, and any time, doesn't it just stand to reason that human activity is contributing to documented changes in our atmosphere and to climate change? I've certainly seen it in my lifetime. But I've also seen people deny our own reason and all evidence around us to even try to argue otherwise. Well, the scientists have done their work. We now better understand the human causes of climate change. We understand its profound and accelerating impact. But unfortunately, too many policymakers deny the evidence, or they refuse to cross political lines, even though they could do that and solve the problem. I say it's time to wake up and take action. We've taken some steps in the right direction. This past summer, President Obama announced his climate action plan to cut carbon pollution. The Environmental Protection Agency has begun creating new carbon emission standards for future power plants. The Department of Energy is working on groundbreaking energy technologies. The Department of Transportation is studying transportation plans to address future risks and vulnerabilities from extreme weather and climate change. The Transportation Department is also addressing something that makes so much sense: vehicle fuel efficiency. That'll save vehicle owners and operators billions of dollars a year, but also means less pollutants in the air. Now, these are all positive changes. But before we rest on our laurels, we have to understand they're not nearly enough to address the problem at hand. Congress needs to cast aside partisan blinders and wake up to this problem by enacting legislation that sets as a priority renewable energy development that will support energy-efficient technology, and legislation will tax carbon pollution. It's time to take a stand against misguided policies and projects that put future generations at risk. In my state, we believe that includes the Keystone XL pipeline. The State Department recently released its long-awaited environmental impact statement on Keystone. I'm deeply troubled the State Department's analysis did not take into account the overwhelming evidence that this project will further accelerate the release of greenhouse gas pollution, which will intensify climate change. There's a mountain of evidence that the carbon pollution, the drinking water threats, the public health threats, the safety threats from the pipeline are so great that it's not in our national interest and this permit should be denied. And I realize I go against public opinion polls we saw this week or this past week and one of the local papers. But I think we have to stamp our addiction to fossil fuels. We have to fight back against these threats to our land and water, air, and healthy communities around the world. And we have to understand that climate change is not simply an environmental change. Creating a green energy sector is not just about cutting greenhouse gas emissions. It's about providing jobs for Americans in America in the renewable energy and energy efficiency fields. It is about strengthening national security in America by having greater control over our energy sources and breaking the stranglehold of oil in the transportation system. But what should unite all of us, Republicans and Democrats alike, is about ensuring that our children and our grandchildren have clean air to breathe. We've come together before. We did this back at the time of President George H.W. Bush. We joined hands across the aisle and across regions in this great country, and we solved large problems. Why can't we do it again? Isn't that the least we owe to our planet? Isn't that the least we owe to our children and grandchildren? Madam President, I see nobody seeking recognition, but I suggest the absence of a quorum.